The morning sun cast long shadows across the dusty courtyard of the Kabul orphanage when the first gunshot shattered the silence. Amelia Taylor didn't flinch. She had heard that sound too many times in the past 18 months to let it startle her anymore. What made her blood freeze was the silence that followed, broken only by the distant rumble of approaching helicopters and the soft whimpering of children who had learned to recognize the difference between celebration and warfare. Preparing and narrating this type of story takes a lot of time and effort. If you like the story, please like the video and subscribe to the channel. If you want to watch every story of our channel, turn on the bell icon. She pressed her back against the concrete wall of the main building, her medical bag clutched tight against her chest. Through the cracked window above her head, she could see the compound's entrance where Staff Sergeant Marcus Chen lay motionless in the dirt, his uniform darkening with blood. 20 feet to his left, Corporal Sarah Williams was dragging herself toward cover, her left leg twisted at an unnatural angle. The ambush had come from nowhere one moment. The joint humanitarian mission was proceeding as planned. The next moment, the world had exploded into chaos. Dr. Taylor. The voice belonged to Lieutenant James Rodriguez, the young Marine who had been assigned as her escort for this mission. He was pinned behind an overturned jeep, his rifle trained on the rooftops, where muzzle flashes continued to appear like deadly fireflies. "We need to get you out of here." But Amelia wasn't looking at the lieutenant. Her eyes were fixed on the small face, pressed against a second-story window of the orphanage. A girl no more than 8 years old, her dark eyes wide with terror. Fatima, the child who had been recovering from malnutrition when the shooting started, too weak to run with the others when the evacuation began. The sound of rotors grew louder, and Amelia could make out the distinctive silhouette of a Black Hawk helicopter cresting the mountains to the east. Help was coming, but it would be minutes before they arrived, minutes that Marcus Chen didn't have, minutes that Fatima couldn't wait. Around her, the sounds of battle continued. Automatic weapons, fire from the surrounding buildings, shouted commands in multiple languages, the desperate cries of wounded soldiers. But in her mind, she was back in her childhood home in Oregon, sitting at her grandfather's bedside as he recounted stories of field medics who had run into enemy fire to save lives. She had always wondered if she would have that kind of courage. When the moment came, now she knew. "Rodriguez." She called out, her voice steady despite the chaos around her. "I'm going for Chen. Negative. Stay put until the SEAL team clears the area." But Amelia was already moving, her medical training taking over as she assessed the tactical situation with the same clinical precision she used to diagnose patients. The sniper fire was coming primarily from the north and east. The western approach to Chen's position offered the best cover. She would have maybe 15 seconds of exposure before reaching him, another 30 to assess his wounds and apply emergency treatment. She sprinted across the courtyard in a low crouch, her boots kicking up small clouds of dust with each step. A bullet whined past her left ear, close enough that she could feel the heat of its passage. Another struck the ground inches from her feet, sending up a spray of dirt and gravel. But she kept running, her grandfather's compass bouncing against her chest with each stride. Chen was unconscious when she reached him, his pulse weak and thready. The bullet had entered his abdomen just below his body armor, a clean entry wound. But she couldn't tell how much internal damage had been done without proper equipment. She pressed her hands against the wound, applying direct pressure while scanning the area for better cover. "Come on, Marcus," she whispered, using his first name for the first time since they had met. "Stay with me." His eyes fluttered open, unfocused and filled with pain. You shouldn't be here. Neither should you, but here we are." She managed to smile despite the gunfire continuing around them. "I need you to stay awake, okay? Tell me about home. Tell me about that girlfriend you're always talking about. Jenny. Chen's voice was barely audible. "We're getting married next month." She's going to be beautiful in her wedding dress. Amelia said, her hands working quickly to pack the wound with gauze. What kind of flowers is she carrying? As Chen struggled to answer, Amelia became aware of new sounds joining the cacophony of battle. The distinctive crack of high-powered sniper rifles, American weapons, firing with precision rather than the wild spray of automatic fire that had characterized the ambush. The SEAL team had arrived. She looked up to see a figure in tactical gear sliding down a rope from the Black Hawk helicopter, which now hovered directly above the courtyard. More SEALs were taking positions on the surrounding rooftops, their coordinated movements speaking to years of training and experience. The tide of battle was turning, but Chen needed immediate medical attention that only a fully equipped trauma center could provide. "Drop your weapons." The command came from multiple directions simultaneously, amplified by electronic bullhorns mounted on the helicopters. "Drop your weapons and surrender." The response was immediate and violent, a fresh barrage of gunfire. From the surrounding buildings, the insurgents clearly choosing to fight rather than surrender. Amelia pressed herself closer to Chen, shielding his body with her own as bullets began to impact the ground around them. Through the chaos, she heard Rodriguez's voice on the radio, coordinating with the SEAL team leader. "We have 2 wounded in the courtyard, Staff Sergeant Chen and Corporal Williams. Dr. Taylor is treating Chen, but they're both exposed. Copy that, Marine. We're setting up a suppression pattern. Get ready to move on my signal." But as Amelia looked around the courtyard, her heart sank. Williams was still conscious, but losing blood fast. She wouldn't be able to move on her own. Chen was slipping in and out of consciousness, his vital signs deteriorating with each passing minute. And somewhere in the building above them, Fatima was trapped with unknown numbers of other children who hadn't made it to the evacuation point in time. She made her choice. She could wait for the SEALs to clear the area, hope that Chen and Williams could hold on long enough for a safe evacuation. Or she could do what her grandfather had done in the jungles of Southeast Asia. Step into the kill zone and trust that courage would be enough. She made her choice, standing up despite the ongoing gunfire. Amelia raised her hands above her head and began walking toward the orphanage entrance. She moved slowly, deliberately, her medical bag clearly visible in her right hand. Behind her, she could hear Rodriguez shouting her name, could hear the SEAL team leader's voice crackling over the radio. But her focus was entirely on the building ahead of her, on the small face that had disappeared from the second-story window. On the children who needed her more than she needed safety. The gunfire stopped. It didn't fade gradually, or peter out as tactical situations often did. It stopped completely, as if someone had thrown a switch. The sudden silence was more unnerving than the chaos had been, filled with potential and danger and the weight of dozens of unseen eyes watching her approach. She took another step forward, then another. The orphanage entrance loomed before her, its wooden door scarred by years of conflict and marked with bullet holes from the morning's battle. Somewhere inside, she could hear voices, adults speaking in rapid Pashto, children crying softly in the background. "My name is Dr. Amelia Taylor," she called out in the local dialect she had learned during her time in Afghanistan. "I am here to help the children. I am not armed." The response came not in words, but in action. The door opened slowly, revealing a figure in traditional Afghan dress, an elderly man with a gray beard and eyes that held decades of pain and resilience. He looked at her for a long moment, then stepped aside to let her pass. As she crossed the threshold into the orphanage, Amelia felt the weight of 100 unseen weapons trained on her back. Behind her, the SEAL team held their positions, ready to react to any threat. Ahead of her lay the unknown children who needed medical attention, insurgents who had chosen this place as their battlefield, and the question that would define everything that followed. Had she just saved lives or sealed her own fate? 6 months earlier, Amelia Taylor had been a different person entirely. She sat in the sterile conference room of Seattle General Hospital, her resignation letter folded neatly in her lap, watching the rain streak down the floor-to-ceiling windows that offered a view of Elliott Bay. Dr. Harrison Webb, the chief of emergency medicine, had been talking for 10 minutes about her future at the hospital, about the research opportunities that awaited her, about the private practice partnerships that would make her wealthy beyond her grandfather's wildest dreams. "You're throwing away everything you've worked for," he said finally, his voice carrying the weight of paternal disappointment. "Afghanistan? Amelia, you're a trauma surgeon, not a war correspondent. Leave the heroics to people who are trained." For it, she remembered the letter that had arrived 3 weeks earlier. The Doctors Without Borders deployment coordinator had been brutally honest about the conditions: minimal resources, maximum danger, and the very real possibility that she might not come home. But between the lines, Amelia had read something else: the chance to practice medicine the way her grandfather had described it, without insurance forms or billing codes, or the comfortable distance that came with modern medical technology. "I've been thinking about this for 2 years," she said, her voice steady despite the tremor in her hands. "Ever since the Morrison case." Webb's expression softened slightly. The Morrison case had been a turning point for both of them, a 7-year-old girl brought in after a car accident, her injuries severe, but treatable with immediate surgery. But the girl's insurance hadn't been pre-approved for the procedure, and hospital administration had insisted on waiting for authorization. By the time the paperwork was processed, internal bleeding had caused irreversible brain damage. Amelia had watched the girl's parents hold their daughter's hand as life support was withdrawn, and something fundamental had broken inside her. "That wasn't your fault," Webb said gently. "The system failed, not you." "The system I'm part of," Amelia replied. "The system I chose to be part of. My grandfather used to tell me stories about treating wounded soldiers in Vietnam, about making life and death decisions based on medical need rather than administrative convenience. I became a doctor to save lives, not to manage spreadsheets." Webb leaned back in his chair, studying her with the same intensity he brought to difficult diagnoses. "Your grandfather also came home with PTSD and spent the last 15 years of his life fighting nightmares. You think following in his footsteps is going to give you the peace he never found?" The question hung in the air like a challenge. Amelia's grandfather, Colonel Thomas Taylor, had indeed struggled with the demons of war long after returning from Southeast Asia, but he had also lived with a sense of purpose that she envied, a certainty that his work had mattered in ways that transcended personal comfort or safety. "Maybe peace isn't the point," she said finally. "Maybe the point is being useful." The luxury of philosophical debate seemed absurd now. Surrounded by the concrete realities of combat medicine, the steady stream of injured soldiers and civilians who arrived at her makeshift clinic, the constant sound of helicopters bringing in casualties from remote outposts, the way exhaustion became a companion rather than an obstacle. Her daily routine had developed its own rhythm over the past 6 months. She woke at 05:00 to the sound of reveille, spent the first hour reviewing patient files and coordinating with the nursing staff, a dedicated team of military medics who had embraced her civilian presence with surprising warmth. By 06:30 she was in the clinic, treating everything from routine infections to traumatic injuries that would have challenged the resources of a major urban hospital. The orphanage visits had begun as a monthly commitment, part of the base's community outreach program. But Amelia had found herself returning more frequently, drawn by the resilience of children who faced each day with hope, despite circumstances that would have broken most adults. Fatima had been her most challenging case, a 8-year-old girl, suffering from severe malnutrition when she arrived at the orphanage, her tiny body bearing the scars of abuse from relatives who had seen her as a burden rather than a blessing. "Dr. Amelia," Fatima would call out whenever she saw her approaching, her English improving with each visit. "Tell me about America. Tell me about the big buildings and the cars that don't need fixing. Those conversations had become precious to both of them. Amelia would describe the Seattle skyline, the ferries crossing Puget Sound, the way Mount Rainier looked on clear days when the morning mist lifted. In return, Fatima would share stories about her dreams. She wanted to be a teacher when she grew up, wanted to help other children learn to read and write in multiple languages. "Why did you come here?" Fatima asked during one visit, her small hand tracing patterns in the dust while they sat in the courtyard. "America is safe. Here is dangerous." Amelia had struggled to find an answer that an 8-year-old could understand. How could she explain the restlessness that had driven her from a comfortable life in Seattle? How could she describe the way her grandfather's stories had planted seeds of wanderlust and purpose that had finally grown too large for the neat boundaries of her previous existence? "Sometimes people need help," she said finally. "And sometimes you're the person who knows how to help them. But don't your family miss you?" The question cut deeper than Amelia expected. Her parents called weekly via satellite phone, their conversations a careful dance around the dangers of her deployment. Her mother worried constantly, sending care packages filled with familiar comforts, her favorite tea, photographs from home, letters from colleagues who didn't understand her decision but supported it nonetheless. Her father, a retired engineer, approached her deployment like a problem to be solved, regularly forwarding news articles about security improvements and reconstruction efforts. But it was her grandfather's absence that she felt most keenly. He had died 3 months before her deployment, his final weeks spent in a hospital bed, much like the ones she now worked around daily. During their last conversation, he had pressed the silver compass into her palm with hands that shook from age and medication. "This kept me centered when everything else was chaos," he had whispered. "Not because it points north, but because it reminds you that every direction is a choice. Some choices are harder than others, but they're all yours to make." Now 6 months into her deployment, Amelia understood what he had meant. Each day brought dozens of choices, which patients to prioritize when resources were limited. Whether to risk dangerous roads to reach remote villages in need of medical attention. How to balance the clinical detachment necessary for effective treatment with the human compassion that made healing possible. Lieutenant Rodriguez had become an unexpected friend during those months, despite the 10-year age gap between them. The young Marine from Texas had been assigned as her security escort for off-base missions, a responsibility he took seriously despite her protests that she could take care of herself. "Ma'am, with all due respect," he would say whenever she complained about the restrictions his presence imposed. "My job is to make sure you make it home to your family. Your job is to save lives. We both do our jobs better when we work together." Their partnership had evolved into something deeper than professional necessity. Rodriguez was bright and curious, full of questions about medical procedures and genuinely interested in the cultural exchange work that occupied much of Amelia's time. He had grown up in a working-class family where military service was both tradition and economic necessity, but his natural intelligence and leadership qualities marked him as future officer material. "Why didn't you go to college?" Amelia asked him during a long convoy ride to a remote village where a measles outbreak threatened to devastate the local population. Rodriguez was quiet for a long moment, his eyes scanning the landscape for potential threats while he considered his answer. "Money, mostly. My dad got hurt on a construction job when I was 16. Couldn't work for 2 years. Military seemed like the best way to serve my country and support my family at the same time." "You could still go to college after your service ends," she suggested. "Pre-med, maybe. You have the aptitude for it." He laughed, but not unkindly. "You think I'd make a good doctor? I think you'd make whatever you chose to be. The question is what you want to be." That conversation had planted seeds that Amelia watched growing over the following months. Rodriguez began reading medical journals during his downtime, asking increasingly sophisticated questions about treatment protocols and diagnostic procedures. He started volunteering at the base clinic during his off-duty hours, helping with inventory management and patient intake procedures. Staff Sergeant Chen represented a different kind of relationship, the professional respect that developed between experienced military personnel and civilian contractors who proved their worth under pressure. Chen was career military, a 15-year veteran who had served multiple deployments in Iraq and Afghanistan. He approached every mission with methodical preparation and tactical awareness that had kept his team safe through countless dangerous situations. Taylor earns her keep. She had overheard him telling a group of newly arrived soldiers, "Doesn't panic under pressure, doesn't ask stupid questions, and doesn't get in the way when things get complicated. She's good people." Coming from Chen, that endorsement carried significant weight. He was respected throughout the base for his competence and integrity, known for his ability to assess people quickly and accurately. His approval had opened doors for Amelia throughout the military community, making her work easier and more effective. But it was Corporal Williams who had challenged Amelia's assumptions about military culture most directly. The 23-year-old medic from Chicago was brilliant, tough, and unafraid to speak her mind about everything from military bureaucracy to gender dynamics in combat zones. "You know what I like about you, Doc?" Williams had said during one of their late-night conversations. "In the base medical facility, you don't try to be one of the guys. You just do your job better than most of the guys, and you let that speak for itself." Williams had joined the Army to pay for medical school, planning to serve her commitment and then return to civilian life as a physician. But her experience in Afghanistan had broadened her perspective on both military service and medical practice in ways she was still processing. "I thought this deployment would be about patching people up and sending them home," she confided. "I didn't realize how much of the work would be about understanding people's different cultures, different ways of thinking about illness and health and recovery." Their conversations often stretched late into the night, two women navigating the complex intersection of medicine and military service in a combat zone. Williams brought a perspective shaped by growing up in urban America, while Amelia's background in suburban privilege created interesting tensions and unexpected common ground. As the months passed, Amelia felt herself changing in ways that would have been impossible to predict from the safety of her Seattle conference room. The work was exactly as challenging as she had expected, perhaps more so. But the rewards were different from anything she had experienced in civilian medicine. There was an immediacy to every decision, a clarity of purpose that cut through the administrative complexity that had made hospital work feel increasingly meaningless. But there were costs as well. She slept poorly, plagued by dreams that mixed memories of patients she couldn't save with fears about patients she might lose tomorrow. She had lost 15 pounds despite the military's calorie-dense field rations, her body burning energy at a rate that reflected the constant stress of operating in a combat environment. The silver compass had become her anchor through it all, a physical reminder of her grandfather's wisdom and her own evolving understanding of courage. She touched it dozens of times each day before entering the operating room, after difficult conversations with patients' families, during the quiet moments when the weight of responsibility felt almost unbearable. Each touch was a small prayer, a request for the strength to make the right choices when they mattered most. The first sign of trouble had come 3 weeks before the orphanage ambush, during what should have been a routine medical supply run to a village 40 kilometers north of the base. Amelia was accompanying Corporal Williams and a small convoy escort when they encountered an improvised roadblock, fallen trees and scattered rocks that could have been the result of a recent landslide or evidence of insurgent activity. "Something's not right about this," Staff Sergeant Chen had said over the radio, his voice carrying the weight of experience with such situations. "The placement is too deliberate. Recommend alternate route." But the alternate route would have added 6 hours to their journey, and the village clinic was expecting critical supplies for a tuberculosis outbreak that had already claimed 12 lives. The medical officer, Major Patricia Hayes, made the decision to proceed with caution, a choice that would haunt everyone involved in the weeks that followed. The ambush came from 3 directions simultaneously, a coordinated attack that spoke to careful planning and intimate knowledge of military convoy procedures. The first explosion disabled the lead vehicle, while small arms fire erupted from concealed positions on both sides of the narrow mountain road. Williams was hit in the opening seconds, a bullet grazing her shoulder as she tried to establish communications with base command. Amelia found herself pressed against the armored side of their vehicle, her medical bag clutched tightly while she assessed the tactical situation with growing alarm. This wasn't the random violence of desperate fighters. It was a calculated assault designed to inflict maximum casualties while preventing reinforcement or escape. Dr. Taylor. Chen's voice cut through the sound of gunfire as he maneuvered to establish a defensive perimeter. Williams needs immediate attention. She crawled across 10 feet of bullet-swept ground to reach the injured corporal, her movements guided by training that had become instinctive during her months in country. Williams was conscious but losing blood rapidly, her military training keeping her functional despite the pain. "It's not that bad," Williams insisted, trying to chamber a round in her rifle with hands that shook from shock and blood loss. "Just patch me up so I can. You're going into shock," Amelia interrupted, her clinical assessment overriding Williams' protestations. "I need you to stay still while I work." The firefight continued around them for 23 minutes, an eternity measured in heartbeats and rifle rounds. When reinforcements finally arrived, driving the attackers into the surrounding mountains, the convoy had sustained casualties that could have been much worse, but felt devastating nonetheless. 2 soldiers wounded, their mission compromised, and intelligence suggesting that their movements were being tracked with disturbing accuracy. The after-action briefing took place in the base command center 12 hours later, with all key personnel present, despite the late hour. Major Hayes presided over the meeting with the controlled anger of a professional soldier who understood that her decisions had put people at risk. "Preliminary intelligence suggests this was a targeted operation," she announced, her voice steady. Despite the obvious fatigue, the insurgents knew our route, our timing, and our standard tactical responses. That level of intelligence represents a significant security breach. Captain Michael Torres, the base intelligence officer, had spent the day coordinating with regional command and Afghan military liaisons. His briefing painted a picture of escalating insurgent activity throughout the province, with particular focus on disrupting humanitarian operations. "They're not just targeting military convoys anymore," Torres explained, gesturing toward a digital map that showed incident locations throughout the region. "Medical facilities, schools, infrastructure, projects, anything that represents cooperation between coalition forces and local communities is becoming a priority target." The implications were clear to everyone in the room. Amelia's medical outreach programs, which had been expanding steadily over the previous months, would need to be curtailed or suspended entirely. The orphanage visits that had become so meaningful to her and so important to children like Fatima represented an unacceptable security risk. "I understand the tactical concerns," she said carefully, aware that her status as a civilian contractor gave her limited influence in such discussions. "But these programs are building relationships that will outlast our military presence here. Cutting them back sends exactly the message these insurgents want to send. That cooperation with international organizations is dangerous." Lieutenant Colonel James Morrison, the base commander, had been listening to the discussion with the patient, attention of someone accustomed to weighing competing priorities under pressure. A 20-year veteran with deployments throughout the Middle East. He understood both the strategic value of community engagement and the tactical realities of operating in an increasingly hostile environment. Dr. Taylor raises valid points, he said finally. But our primary responsibility is force protection. We can't maintain these programs if they're putting personnel at unnecessary risk. The debate continued for another hour with various officers, contributing perspectives shaped by their specific responsibilities, logistics, intelligence, operations, and medical support. It was Rodriguez who eventually suggested the compromise that would define their operations for the following weeks. What? If we randomize the schedules and routes, he proposed. Make it impossible for anyone to predict when we'll be where. It increases the complexity for us, but it also eliminates the pattern recognition that's making us vulnerable. The solution seemed reasonable in theory, but its implementation created new problems that none of them had anticipated. The randomized schedules made it difficult for village clinics to prepare for their visits, reducing the effectiveness of medical interventions and creating frustration among local populations who depended on regular care. The varied routes required additional reconnaissance and security preparation, stretching already limited resources and delaying time-sensitive missions. More troubling was the growing sense that their efforts to improve operational security were being countered by an increasingly sophisticated intelligence network. Attacks continued to occur with timing and precision that suggested inside knowledge, despite their efforts to compartmentalize mission planning and limit advance. Notification of specific operations. The breakthrough came during the second week of the new security protocols, when Corporal Williams recovered from her shoulder wound but assigned to light duty, noticed discrepancies in supply requisitions that had been submitted by local contractors. "Look at this," she said, spreading paperwork across Amelia's desk in the medical facility. 3 different suppliers are ordering identical quantities of the same items, but they're supposed to be servicing completely different areas. Amelia studied the documents, her medical training lending itself surprisingly well to pattern recognition and data analysis. The inconsistencies Williams had identified were subtle but significant order quantities that didn't match reported population sizes, delivery schedules that clustered around known military operations, and contact information that traced back to the same regional communication networks. This could be how they're tracking our movements, she realized. Every time we request supplies for a specific location, we're essentially broadcasting our operational intent. The discovery led to a comprehensive review of all contractor relationships and supply chain procedures, an investigation that revealed a network of information sharing that had been operating under their noses for months. It wasn't malicious in most cases. Local contractors were simply communicating with each other about business opportunities and logistical challenges. But that communication created intelligence opportunities for anyone with the resources and motivation to collect and analyze the information systematically. Captain Torres coordinated the response with his characteristic methodical approach. But the scope of the problem made simple solutions impossible. We could terminate all local contracts and handle everything through military channels, he explained during another late-night briefing. But that would eliminate most of our community engagement and probably create more enemies than it prevents. The alternative was a complex restructuring of their entire logistical operation, compartmentalizing information, creating false operational plans to confuse potential surveillance, and implementing security protocols that would make every mission more complicated and time-consuming. As the new procedures took effect, Amelia found herself increasingly isolated from the community work that had originally motivated her deployment. The orphanage visits were reduced to monthly inspections with heavy security escorts. Medical outreach programs were limited to emergency responses rather than preventive care. The relationships she had built over 6 months were withering under the pressure of operational security requirements. "This isn't what I came here to do," she confided to Rodriguez during one of their increasingly rare conversations. The young lieutenant had been assigned additional responsibilities as part of the security restructuring, leaving him little time for the philosophical discussions that had helped both of them process their experiences. "I know it's frustrating," he replied, fatigue evident in his voice. "But the alternative might be losing more people like Williams or worse." The reminder was sobering but didn't alleviate Amelia's growing sense that their response to the security threats was allowing the insurgents to achieve their strategic objectives without firing another shot. By forcing the coalition forces to retreat into defensive isolation, the attacks were effectively ending the community engagement programs that represented the most hopeful aspect of their presence in Afghanistan. The situation reached a crisis point during the third week of the new security protocols, when intelligence reports indicated that insurgent forces were planning a major attack on the base itself. The threat was credible enough to justify lockdown procedures that confined all personnel to the immediate compound, canceling all off-base operations indefinitely. Amelia spent 3 days pacing the confines of the medical facility, her frustration growing with each passing hour. Outside the wire, she knew that villagers were waiting for medical care that wouldn't come, that children at the orphanage were asking when Dr. Amelia would return, that the carefully built relationships of the past 6 months were dissolving in the acid of fear and mistrust. On the morning of the 4th day, she made a decision that would have far-reaching consequences for everyone involved. Against explicit orders and established protocols, she submitted a request to accompany a supply convoy to the orphanage, a mission that had been classified as non-essential and postponed indefinitely. Major Hayes denied the request immediately, citing the ongoing threat assessment and the critical nature of maintaining base security during the lockdown period. But Amelia persisted, arguing that the orphanage's medical needs constituted a humanitarian emergency that justified the risk. "Dr. Taylor," the major said during their final conversation on the subject, "I understand your commitment to these children, but I won't authorize a mission that puts military personnel at risk for objectives that can be deferred until the security situation improves." "And if the security situation never improves?" Amelia asked. "How long do we wait while children suffer from preventable illnesses and treatable injuries?" The question hung between them like an indictment of the entire military approach to humanitarian operations in contested areas. Both women understood the fundamental tension between security and mission accomplishment, between force protection and the objectives that justified their presence in Afghanistan. That night, alone in her quarters, Amelia held her grandfather's compass and tried to imagine what he would have done in similar circumstances. The stories he had told her were filled with moments when medical personnel had to choose between safety and duty, between following orders and following conscience. She thought about Fatima, about the promise she had made to return with medicine for the child's recurring respiratory infections. She thought about the other children at the orphanage, about the staff members who had risked their own safety to provide care and education in one of the world's most dangerous places. She thought about the mission statement that had brought her to Afghanistan to provide medical care without regard to politics, race, religion, or military affiliation. By morning, her decision was made. She would find a way to reach the orphanage, with or without official authorization. The consequences would be severe possible court-martial for any military personnel who assisted her, immediate termination of her contract with Doctors Without Borders, and likely permanent exile from future humanitarian deployments. But some choices, she realized, were bigger than consequences. Some promises were more important than protocols. And sometimes the difference between courage and cowardice was measured not in the bullets you faced, but in the children you refused to abandon. The silver compass pointed north, as it always had. But north, she understood now, was wherever duty led, regardless of the dangers that waited in that direction. The morning of the orphanage mission began before dawn, with Amelia making final preparations in the pre-deployment darkness that had become familiar over her months in Afghanistan. She had convinced Lieutenant Rodriguez to include her in what was officially designated as a reconnaissance and supply assessment. mission bureaucratic language that provided just enough ambiguity to justify her presence while avoiding the explicit humanitarian objectives that would have triggered additional security reviews. Staff Sergeant Chen had been assigned as mission commander, a responsibility he accepted with his characteristic professional skepticism. During their pre-mission briefing, his concerns were evident despite his diplomatic phrasing. "Doc, I want you to understand that we're operating under heightened threat conditions," he said, his voice carrying the weight of recent intelligence reports. "If we encounter resistance, our primary objective becomes extraction and survival. The supply assessment becomes secondary to bringing everyone home alive." Amelia nodded her understanding, but privately she knew that her own priorities might diverge from military doctrine if circumstances forced impossible choices. Fatima and the other children at the orphanage had been waiting for medical supplies, for 2 weeks' supplies that could mean the difference between recovery and permanent disability, between treatment and unnecessary suffering. Corporal Williams, cleared for duty despite ongoing physical therapy for her shoulder injury, had volunteered for the mission over the objections of the base medical officer. Her presence added both medical capability and combat experience to their small team, but it also represented another variable in an already complex tactical equation. "Williams, you sure you're ready for this?" Chen asked during their final equipment. "Check. No shame in sitting this one out if you're not feeling 100%. "I'm good to go, Sergeant," she replied, her voice steady despite the obvious discomfort of carrying a full combat load with a recently healed shoulder wound. "Besides, someone needs to watch Doc's back while she's playing Florence Nightingale." The comment was made with affection rather than criticism, but it highlighted the fundamental tension between Amelia's humanitarian objectives and the military team's force protection responsibilities. Both priorities were valid, but they didn't always align, especially when split-second decisions had to be made under fire. The convoy consisted of 3 armored vehicles, following a route that had been selected using the randomization protocols implemented after the previous ambush. Intelligence reports indicated minimal insurgent activity in their target area, but everyone involved understood that intelligence in Afghanistan was often incomplete, outdated, or deliberately misleading. During the 90-minute drive to the orphanage, Amelia found herself reviewing the medical supplies she had prioritized for this mission. Antibiotics for respiratory infections, pain medication for children recovering from malnutrition, vitamins and nutritional supplements that could prevent the kind of developmental delays she had seen too often during her previous visits. Each item represented a life that could be improved, a future that could be preserved. Rodriguez sat across from her in the cramped vehicle, his attention divided between monitoring radio communications and studying the landscape for potential threats. The young lieutenant had grown considerably during his months in Afghanistan, his initial enthusiasm tempered by experience, but not diminished by it. He understood the importance of their mission while maintaining the tactical awareness that had kept his team safe through dozens of dangerous operations. "Doc," he said quietly, his voice barely audible over the vehicle's engine noise, "when we get to the orphanage, I need you to stick close to either Chen or Williams. Don't go wandering off to check on kids in different buildings without escort. This whole area has been quiet for too long. That usually means something's brewing." Amelia appreciated his concern, but she also knew that effective medical treatment sometimes required moving beyond the comfort zones that military protocols established. Children were afraid of armed soldiers, especially those who had experienced the trauma that brought them to places like the orphanage. Building trust required a different approach and establishing security perimeters. "I'll be careful," she promised, touching the silver compass at her throat. "But I also need to be effective. These kids have been waiting for medical attention for 2 weeks because of security restrictions. If I can't actually treat them properly, this whole mission becomes a waste of resources." The conversation was interrupted by Chen's voice over the radio. reporting their approach to the orphanage compound. The building looked exactly as Amelia remembered it, a two-story concrete structure surrounded by a low wall with a courtyard that served as both playground and community gathering space. But something felt different as they dismounted from their vehicles, a tension in the air that hadn't been present during her previous visits. The orphanage director, Ahmad Hassan, met them at the entrance with his usual gracious hospitality, but Amelia noticed immediately that his demeanor was more subdued than normal. Hassan was a man in his 50s who had dedicated his life to caring for children orphaned by decades of conflict, and his ability to read dangerous situations had kept his charges safe through countless threats and challenges. "Dr. Amelia," he said in English, embracing her warmly despite the presence of armed soldiers. "The children have been asking about you every day. Fatima especially, she has been practicing the English words you taught her." But as Hassan led them into the building, he spoke quietly in Pashto, his words carrying a warning that chilled Amelia's blood. "There are men in the village who are watching this place. They came yesterday asking questions about American visitors, about when the soldiers come and how many weapons they carry." Chen's reaction was immediate and professional. Without changing his relaxed posture or alerting the children to any danger, he activated his radio and reported the intelligence to their base command. Within minutes, he received confirmation that additional security assets were being repositioned to provide overwatch and rapid response capability if needed. "How many men?" Rodriguez asked Hassan in carefully pronounced Pashto, his language skills improving steadily during his deployment. "6 that I have seen," Hassan replied. "Maybe more. They dress like farmers, but they carry themselves like soldiers. And they have too much interest in this place for people who claim to be visiting relatives in the village." The tactical situation was deteriorating, but Amelia's medical assessment of the children revealed needs that couldn't wait for improved security conditions. Fatima's respiratory infection had worsened significantly since her last visit, and 3 other children showed signs of developing complications from treatable conditions that had been left unattended for too long. Williams established a security position that allowed her to monitor both the courtyard and the approaches to the building while Amelia worked. Her combat experience had taught her to read terrain and tactical situations with instincts that complemented Chen's methodical approach to threat assessment. "Something's definitely wrong here," she reported quietly over their internal communications. Network. Too many fighting-age males hanging around for a village this size, and they're all paying too much attention to our vehicles. Chen made the decision to accelerate their timeline, reducing what should have been a 4-hour mission to 2 hours maximum. "Doc, I need you to prioritize the most critical cases and prepare for rapid extraction if necessary. We're not going to have time for a complete medical evaluation of every kid." But as Amelia began her abbreviated medical assessments, she discovered problems that made rapid extraction impossible. Fatima's condition required immediate treatment with antibiotics and breathing treatments that would take at least an hour to administer properly. Another child, a boy named Omar, who had arrived at the orphanage just days earlier, showed signs of severe dehydration and malnutrition that demanded careful rehydration protocols. "I need more time," she told Chen, her medical training overriding her awareness of the developing security situation. "These children will die if I don't treat them properly, and proper treatment takes time." Chen's response reflected the impossible position that military personnel often faced when humanitarian needs conflicted with tactical realities. "Doc, I understand your concerns, but my responsibility is getting this team home alive. If the situation deteriorates, we extract immediately regardless of medical considerations." The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was resolved by an unexpected development that changed everything about their mission. Hassan approached them with information that shifted their entire understanding of the threat they were facing. "The men who have been watching," he said carefully, glancing around to ensure their conversation couldn't be overheard by the children. "I have learned that they are not here to attack you. They are here to protect someone who is coming to meet you." The revelation was so unexpected that it took several moments for its implications to register. Chen's immediate response was to assume deception or misunderstanding, but Hassan's next words eliminated any ambiguity about the situation. "There's a Taliban commander whose son is one of the children here. He has been negotiating through intermediaries for weeks, trying to arrange a meeting where his child can receive medical treatment without compromising his own position or yours." The intelligence was stunning in its complexity and its potential ramifications. A Taliban commander seeking medical treatment for his child represented both an unprecedented opportunity for dialogue and an enormous security risk for everyone involved. If genuine, it suggested that even Afghanistan's most hardened fighters recognized the value of neutral medical care. If false, it could be an elaborate trap designed to capture or kill American military personnel. Chen's training had prepared him for many contingencies, but not for this particular moral and tactical dilemma. His radio report to base command generated an immediate response: hold position, gather more intelligence, and wait for guidance from higher command levels that had the authority to make decisions with such far-reaching political implications. While they waited for orders, Amelia continued treating the children who needed immediate medical attention. Fatima responded well to the antibiotics and bronchodilator treatments, her breathing improving noticeably within the first hour. Omar's rehydration proceeded more slowly, requiring careful monitoring to prevent complications from too rapid fluid replacement, but it was during her examination of a new arrival, a girl approximately 10 years old who had been brought to the orphanage just 2 days earlier, that Amelia made a discovery that would reshape everyone's understanding of their situation. The child, who spoke only Pashto and seemed terrified of the armed soldiers, had injuries that told a story of recent violence. Burns on her hands and arms that were consistent with explosions, hearing damage that suggested exposure to gunfire, and psychological trauma that manifested in the hypervigilance and startle responses common among combat veterans. "Hassan," Amelia called quietly, "can you ask her what happened? Where did these injuries come from?" The conversation that followed was conducted in rapid Pashto, with Hassan's expression growing increasingly grave as the child's story emerged. When he turned to translate for the Americans, his words carried implications that extended far beyond the immediate medical situation. "She says her village was attacked 3 days ago by men in American uniforms, but they spoke a language she didn't recognize, and they killed people who were trying to surrender. Her father brought her here because he said the real Americans would provide protection and medical care that the false Americans had made necessary." The revelation hit like a physical blow. False flag operations using American equipment and uniforms were a known insurgent tactic, but encountering the victims firsthand made the abstract threat suddenly personal and immediate. This child's trauma was the direct result of insurgents deliberately impersonating American forces to turn local populations against coalition efforts. Chen's radio crackled with new orders from base command: maintain position and gather detailed intelligence about the false flag operation. Priority intelligence requirement: identify perpetrators, equipment used, and intended targets for future operations. But before Chen could begin the detailed debriefing that his orders required, the sound of approaching vehicles announced the arrival of the individuals Hassan had warned them about. Through the windows, they could see a convoy of civilian trucks approaching the orphanage compound. Vehicles that could contain either the Taliban commander Hassan had mentioned or the insurgents responsible for the false flag operation that had traumatized the young girl. Williams took position at a window that provided overwatch of the courtyard, her rifle ready but not visible to anyone approaching the building. Rodriguez moved to a position that would allow him to cover the main entrance, while Chen coordinated with their base to ensure that Rapid reinforcement was available if needed, but it was Amelia who made the decision that would define everything that followed. As the vehicles approached and the children in the orphanage began to show signs of fear and confusion, she realized that her role as a medical professional transcended the military considerations that dominated everyone else's thinking. "Hassan," she said firmly, "tell whoever is coming that this is a medical facility providing humanitarian care to children. No weapons are allowed inside the building, and anyone who wants to discuss medical treatment for their child will do so under medical protocols, not military ones." The declaration was both brave and naive, an assertion of civilian medical authority in a situation where armed force was the primary currency of negotiation. But it also established clear ground rules that could provide a framework for the unprecedented encounter that was about to unfold. Chen started to object, his tactical training screaming warnings about the security implications of Amelia's approach. But before he could voice his concerns, the first of the approaching vehicles entered the compound and its occupants began to emerge. The man who approached the orphanage entrance was not what any of them had expected. Middle-aged, dressed in traditional Afghan clothing, he moved with the careful dignity of someone accustomed to authority, but currently operating outside his normal sphere of control. Behind him came two younger men who were obviously bodyguards, their eyes constantly scanning for threats while maintaining weapons discipline that suggested professional military training. But it was the small figure walking beside the older man that silenced all tactical considerations and reduced the entire situation to its human elements. A boy, perhaps 7 years old, leaning heavily on his father's arm, his left leg twisted in a way that spoke of old injury and chronic pain. Hassan met them at the entrance, conducting a brief conversation in Pashto before turning to translate for the Americans. "This is Commander Rashid Khan. His son Halil was injured in a bombing 6 months ago. The boy's leg was set incorrectly and he cannot walk properly. The commander asks if the American doctor can help his child." The moment stretched like a held breath, filled with implications that would ripple far beyond the immediate medical situation. Amelia looked at the injured boy, at his father's carefully controlled expression, at her own team members who were waiting for her decision about how to proceed. The silver compass at her throat seemed to pulse with accumulated wisdom, her grandfather's voice reminding her that some choices define not just individual character, but the meaning of the work itself. This was why she had come to Afghanistan, why she had left the safety and comfort of Seattle, why she wore the symbol of someone who had faced similar choices in another war decades earlier. "Tell Commander Khan," she said clearly, "that I am honored to treat his son. But treatment will take place according to medical protocols, with the safety and dignity of all the children in this facility as my primary concern." The response was immediate and unexpected. Commander Khan stepped forward and in careful English replied directly, "Dr. Taylor, I have heard of your work in this province. You treat all children the same, regardless of their family or their father's politics. This is why I have come to you instead of seeking help elsewhere." The revelation that Khan knew her name and reputation added new layers of complexity to an already extraordinary situation. But it also provided the foundation for what would become the most important medical and diplomatic encounter of Amelia's deployment, a treatment session that would transform not just one child's future, but the entire dynamic between coalition forces and local populations in ways that none of them could have imagined. As she prepared to examine Halil Khan's injured leg, Amelia touched her grandfather's compass one final time, drawing strength from the reminder that courage was not the absence of fear, but the choice to act rightly despite fear. The next few hours would test that courage in ways that no medical school or military training could have prepared her for. The examination of Halil Khan's leg took place in the orphanage's makeshift medical facility, a converted classroom with basic equipment that Amelia had helped establish during her previous visits. The boy's injury was exactly as his father had described, a badly healed fracture that had left his left leg 3 inches shorter than his right, with bone fragments that caused chronic pain and severely limited mobility. "This can be fixed," she told Commander Khan after completing her assessment, "but it will require surgery at a properly equipped medical facility, followed by months of physical therapy and rehabilitation." Khan's response revealed the depth of his desperation and the complexity of his position within the Taliban hierarchy. "Dr. Taylor, I cannot take my son to Kabul for treatment. My presence there would endanger both him and your medical colleagues. But perhaps perhaps there is another way." The solution they developed over the following hour represented an unprecedented collaboration between American military forces and Taliban leadership. Khan would arrange for his son to be brought to the coalition base hospital under the cover of a prisoner transfer, allowing Amelia to perform the necessary surgery while maintaining the fiction that Halil was simply another casualty of the ongoing conflict. Chen's radio communications with base command during this negotiation process created a buzz of activity that extended all the way to regional headquarters. The tactical implications of treating a Taliban commander's son were obvious, but the potential intelligence and diplomatic benefits were equally significant. "Sir," Chen reported to Lieutenant Colonel Morrison, "we have an opportunity to demonstrate medical neutrality while potentially opening dialogue channels that haven't existed before. Request permission to proceed with medical treatment under enhanced security protocols." The approval came with conditions that reflected the extraordinary nature of the situation. Additional security assets would be positioned around the orphanage during the initial treatment phase, and Khan would be required to provide information about insurgent medical needs throughout the province in exchange for ongoing care for his son. But it was Williams who identified the most important aspect of what was developing. "This isn't just about one kid," she said during a brief private conversation with Amelia. "Khan is essentially vouching for our medical neutrality to every Taliban fighter in this province. If word gets out that we treated his son properly and didn't use the opportunity to capture or harm him, it changes the entire dynamic." The treatment of Halil's leg required 3 separate procedures over the course of 2 weeks. An initial surgery to remove bone fragments and reset the fracture, followed by 2 additional operations to lengthen the leg using techniques that Amelia had learned during her residency but never expected to employ in a combat zone. Creating detailed medical stories like this requires extensive research and careful attention to accuracy. If you're finding this story engaging and educational, please like the video and share it with others who might benefit from these real-world medical scenarios. Don't forget to subscribe for more in-depth stories. Each procedure took place under the most unusual circumstances of her medical career. Khan remained at the base throughout his son's treatment, technically classified as a detainee but housed in quarters that reflected his cooperation rather than his enemy status. His presence created intelligence opportunities that military interrogators had never anticipated, while his observations of American medical care provided insights into coalition capabilities that no Taliban leader had previously possessed. "Your doctors work very hard to save lives," Khan observed during one of their conversations about Halil's recovery progress. "This is different from what my fighters have been told about American intentions in Afghanistan." The comment opened dialogue that extended far beyond medical treatment. Khan described a Taliban leadership structure that was far more complex and divided than American intelligence had understood, with significant factions that were motivated more by opposition to foreign occupation than by religious extremism or territorial ambitions. "Many of my men fight because they believe Americans will never leave Afghanistan voluntarily," he explained. "They think the only way to protect their families and their culture is to make the cost of staying higher than the cost of leaving." Rodriguez, who had been assigned as Khan's primary liaison during the treatment period, found these conversations both fascinating and troubling. His growing understanding of Taliban motivations challenged many of the assumptions that had guided American military strategy throughout the deployment. "Sir," he reported to Chen during one of their daily briefings, "Khan is describing counterinsurgency tactics that seem designed to prolong conflict rather than achieve military victory. It's like they're trying to win by not losing rather than trying to win by defeating us." The strategic implications were profound, but they were overshadowed by the immediate human drama of Khalil's recovery. The boy's response to proper medical treatment was remarkable. Within days of his first surgery, he was walking with assistance for the first time in months. His father's reaction to this progress revealed emotions that none of the Americans had expected to see from a Taliban commander. "In Afghanistan, we have a saying," Khan told Amelia during one of their bedside conversations. "A child's laughter is worth more than a commander's victory. You have given me back my son's laughter." But the most significant development came during the second week of Khalil's treatment, when Hassan brought news that would transform the entire trajectory of their mission. The false flag operation that had injured the young girl now in the orphanage had been conducted by a splinter group that Khan's forces had been tracking for weeks. "Commander Khan says these men are criminals, not true Taliban," Hassan translated. "They use American equipment stolen from captured convoys to attack villages and blame Americans for the violence. His forces will help your military find these men and stop their operations." The intelligence sharing that followed led to the most successful counterinsurgency operation of the deployment's final months. Khan's forces provided detailed information about the splinter group's leadership, equipment, and operational patterns, while American forces contributed surveillance capabilities and tactical coordination that neither side could have achieved independently. The joint operation that resulted was never officially acknowledged by either American or Taliban leadership, but its effects were felt throughout the province. The false flag attack stopped completely. Insurgent recruitment in the target villages declined significantly, and civilian casualties from coalition operations dropped to their lowest level since the deployment began. More importantly, the precedent established by Khalil's treatment created new possibilities for medical cooperation that extended far beyond the immediate tactical situation. Khan arranged for other Taliban fighters to receive medical care at coalition facilities, while American medical personnel were allowed to treat civilian casualties in villages that had previously been off-limits to coalition forces. Amelia found herself at the center of these developments, her medical neutrality serving as a bridge between opposing forces that had spent years trying to kill each other. The orphanage became an unofficial neutral zone where information could be exchanged, grievances could be aired, and limited cooperation could develop without compromising the military positions of either side. "Doc," Chen told her during one of their final conversations at the orphanage, "I've served 3 deployments in Afghanistan, and I've never seen anything like what you've accomplished here. You've created something that military strategists have been trying to achieve for years, but it was Fatima who provided the most meaningful assessment of what had changed." During Amelia's final visit to the orphanage before her deployment ended, the young girl presented her with a drawing that depicted children of various ethnicities playing together in the courtyard, while adults in both military uniforms and traditional dress watched approvingly from the background. "This is my picture of peace," Fatima explained in English that had improved dramatically during their months of conversation. "It is not about no fighting. It is about people choosing to take care of children instead of fighting." The wisdom in those words stayed with Amelia during her final weeks in Afghanistan, as she prepared for the transition back to civilian life that she had been dreading for months. The intensity and purpose of her deployment had spoiled her for the comfortable routines of American medical practice, but returning to Afghanistan was no longer an option given the changing security situation and her evolving role in diplomatic initiatives. The solution came from an unexpected source, Commander Khan himself. who approached her with a proposal that would allow her to continue her work while addressing larger strategic objectives. Through intermediaries, he suggested the establishment of a medical training program that would teach Taliban fighters basic field medicine while providing American medical personnel with insights into traditional Afghan healing practices. Your knowledge combined with our understanding of local conditions could save many lives on both sides, Khan explained during their final meeting at the base hospital. But it must be done carefully, with respect for both military necessities and cultural sensitivities. The program that resulted from this suggestion would eventually become a model for medical cooperation in conflict zones throughout the region. Amelia spent 6 months after her deployment ended working with military planners and international humanitarian organizations to develop training protocols that could be implemented without compromising operational security or cultural authenticity. Rodriguez, whose deployment ended 2 weeks after Amelia's, played a crucial role in these planning sessions. His language skills and cultural knowledge, combined with his military experience, made him an ideal liaison between American and Afghan medical personnel. "Ma'am," he said during one of their final coordination meetings, "I've decided to take your advice about college. I'm applying for early admission to pre-med programs, with the goal of returning to Afghanistan as a military doctor who understands both sides of this conflict." Williams chose a different path, accepting a position with Doctors Without Borders that would allow her to apply her combat medical experience to humanitarian operations in other conflict zones. Her departure from military service represented a growing trend among medical personnel who had discovered that their skills were needed more urgently in civilian humanitarian contexts than in traditional military roles. "The war taught me that the most important battles are fought in hospital rooms, not on battlefields," she explained during her exit interview. "I want to spend my career saving lives rather than repairing the damage caused by people trying to take them." Chen's perspective on their shared experience was characteristically practical but deeply felt. As a career soldier approaching retirement, he had seen enough deployments to recognize the unique nature of what they had accomplished. During their final months in Afghanistan, "Doc Taylor changed the way I think about counterinsurgency," he said during his final evaluation report. "She proved that winning hearts and minds isn't just a slogan, it's a tactical approach that can achieve objectives that conventional military operations can't touch." The legacy of Khalil Khan's treatment extended far beyond the immediate medical and diplomatic successes it generated. The boy's recovery became a symbol within Taliban ranks of American willingness to provide aid without political conditions, while his father's cooperation demonstrated to coalition forces that even hardened insurgents could be motivated by shared humanitarian concerns. 3 months after Amelia's departure from Afghanistan, she received a letter through diplomatic channels that brought news of Khalil's continued progress. The boy was not only walking normally, but had begun attending school at the orphanage, where Hassan had arranged for him to receive education alongside children from families with very different political affiliations. "My son asks about the American doctor who fixed his leg," Khan wrote in carefully constructed English. "I tell him that there are good people in every army, and that someday he might choose to help people the way she helped him." But it was the final paragraph of Khan's letter that provided the most meaningful validation of everything Amelia had risked during her deployment. "The fighting continues, but it is different now. My men know that Americans can choose mercy over victory, and American soldiers know that Taliban fighters can choose cooperation over conflict. This knowledge may not end the war, but it makes peace possible to imagine." The orphanage itself underwent significant changes in the months following Amelia's departure. Additional international support flowed to the facility as word spread about its role in facilitating unprecedented cooperation between opposing forces. Hassan was able to expand educational programs, improve medical facilities, and establish satellite locations that served children throughout the province. Fatima's progress exemplified the broader changes taking place. Her English skills improved to the point where she was able to serve as a translator for visiting medical personnel, while her dream of becoming a teacher evolved into specific plans for higher education and eventual leadership of educational programs for war-affected children. 2 years after Amelia's deployment ended, she received an invitation that brought her story full circle. The orphanage was hosting a ceremony to dedicate a new medical facility, and both Hassan and Chen requested her presence as the guest of honor. The Afghanistan she returned to for that brief visit was different from the one she had left. The violence continued, but the medical cooperation programs she had helped establish had created pockets of stability and collaboration that served as models for broader diplomatic initiatives. Standing in the courtyard where she had once run through gunfire to treat wounded soldiers, Amelia watched Halil Khan play soccer with other children, his formerly injured leg showing no signs of the damage that had once limited his mobility. His laughter echoed off the walls of buildings that had been rebuilt and expanded, a sound that carried the promise of possibilities that none of them had dared to imagine during the darkest days of the conflict. The silver compass at her throat caught the afternoon sunlight as she touched it unconsciously, remembering her grandfather's words about courage and choice. Every direction was still a choice, but some directions led toward hope rather than away from it. As the ceremony concluded and she prepared to return to her new position coordinating international medical response teams, Amelia reflected on the unpredictable paths that had brought her to this moment. The girl who had once sat in a Seattle conference room questioning the meaning of her medical career had become a woman who understood that healing was not just about treating individual patients, but about mending the relationships that allowed communities to thrive despite impossible circumstances. 3 years later, Dr. Amelia Taylor stood at the podium of the Geneva Convention Center, addressing an audience of military medical personnel, international humanitarian workers, and diplomatic officials from 37 countries. The Conference on Medical Neutrality in Conflict Zones had drawn attendees from every major conflict area in the world, but the session she was presenting focused specifically on the Afghanistan model that had emerged from her experiences at the orphanage. Medical neutrality, she began, her voice carrying the confidence of someone who had tested abstract principles against brutal realities, is not a passive stance. It requires active courage, constant vigilance, and the willingness to step into spaces where others fear to go. In the audience, she could see familiar faces that connected her current work to the experiences that had shaped her understanding of medicine's role in conflict resolution. Lieutenant Colonel Rodriguez, now Dr. Rodriguez, sat in the front row, his captain's bars reflecting the accelerated promotion track he had earned through his unique combination of military experience and medical expertise. His deployment to Syria as a military physician had applied many of the lessons learned during their shared time in Afghanistan. Corporal Williams, now Dr. Williams as well, occupied a seat in the section reserved for Doctors Without Borders representatives. Her work coordinating medical responses in conflict zones throughout sub-Saharan Africa had established her as one of the organization's most effective field coordinators, with particular expertise in situations where humanitarian workers operated alongside military forces. But it was the presence of Ahmad, Hassan, and Halil Khan, now 15 years old and serving as a translator for Afghan diplomatic missions, that made this presentation personally meaningful for Amelia. Their attendance at the conference represented the international recognition that the orphanage had achieved as a model for humanitarian cooperation in contested areas. The fundamental breakthrough, Amelia continued, came from recognizing that medical care creates relationships that transcend political divisions. When we treat people's children, we're not just addressing immediate medical needs, we're building foundations for broader cooperation, that can outlast military conflicts. Her presentation included case studies from 7 different countries, where medical neutrality protocols had been adapted to local conditions and cultural contexts. The Afghanistan model had proven remarkably transferable, with similar successes achieved in Somalia, Yemen, Ukraine, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. The statistical evidence was compelling. Civilian casualties in areas where medical neutrality agreements had been implemented dropped by an average of 43%, while cooperation between opposing forces on humanitarian issues increased by an even larger margin. But Amelia knew that the real measure of success was not found in statistics, but in individual stories of healing and reconciliation. After her presentation, she joined Hassan and Khalil for dinner at a restaurant overlooking Lake Geneva. The conversation moved easily between English, Pashto, and the mixture of languages that had become their common tongue during years of correspondence and occasional meetings. "Dr. Amelia," Khalil said, his English now fluent despite the accent that marked his Afghan origins, "I want to study medicine at university in America. Will you help me with the application process?" The request was both gratifying and complex. Khalil's unique background, the son of a Taliban commander who had been treated by American military doctors, made him an ideal candidate for programs designed to train medical personnel for work in conflict zones. But it also meant navigating visa processes, security reviews, and cultural adjustments that would challenge even the most determined applicant. "Of course," she replied. "But remember that becoming a doctor requires not just intelligence and dedication, but the willingness to serve people whose backgrounds and beliefs may be very different from your own." "Like you served me," Khalil said simply. "And like you served my father, even though he was your enemy." The comment reminded Amelia of a conversation she had shared with Khan during her most recent visit to Afghanistan 6 months earlier. The former Taliban commander had evolved into an advocate for medical cooperation, using his influence within insurgent networks to protect humanitarian workers and facilitate medical treatment for fighters on both sides of ongoing conflicts. "Your work saved more than my son's leg," Khan had told her during that visit. "It saved my understanding of what Americans could choose to be in Afghanistan. That understanding has shaped every decision I have made since." Khan's influence had been crucial in preventing attacks on medical facilities throughout the province, while his cooperation with coalition forces had contributed to intelligence that prevented dozens of planned attacks on civilian targets. But his most important contribution had been demonstrating to other Taliban leaders that engagement with international humanitarian organizations could advance Afghan interests more effectively than pure opposition. The ripple effects of these changes continued to expand in ways that surprised everyone involved. Medical cooperation agreements had evolved into broader humanitarian ceasefires that allowed for school construction, infrastructure repair, and economic development projects that benefited communities regardless of their political affiliations. 5 years later, Amelia received news of Staff Sergeant Chen's retirement from military service while she was conducting a training seminar for military medical personnel at Fort Bragg. His 20-year career had concluded with assignments that utilized the expertise in cross-cultural medical cooperation he had developed during their shared deployment. Chen's final assignment had been establishing medical neutrality protocols for special operations forces, work that required the kind of nuanced understanding of local cultures and political dynamics that conventional military training didn't provide. His experience treating Khan's son had become a case study taught at the Army War College and the Naval Postgraduate School. "Doc," Chen wrote in his farewell message, "I wanted you to know that everything we learned in Afghanistan has continued to pay dividends throughout my career. The military is finally understanding that winning hearts and minds requires actually healing hearts and minds, not just talking about it." Chen's retirement coincided with Williams' appointment as regional director for doctors, without borders operations in Central Asia, a position that would allow her to oversee medical programs in Afghanistan, Pakistan, and several former Soviet republics where conflicts continued to create humanitarian emergencies. Rodriguez had completed his residency in emergency medicine and accepted a position with the military medical corps that would deploy him to conflicts where his language skills and cultural knowledge could be applied to new challenges. His first assignment would be establishing medical cooperation protocols in Mali, where French and American forces were working with local militaries to combat insurgent groups with tactics similar to those they had encountered in Afghanistan. But it was the letter Amelia received from Fatima that provided the most meaningful update on the lives that had been shaped by their shared experiences. Now 19 years old and enrolled in a teacher training program in Kabul, Fatima had become an advocate for educational opportunities for girls from conflict-affected areas. Dr. Amelia, she wrote in English that had evolved far beyond their early conversations. I am teaching children who live the same life I lived when you first came to the orphanage. When they ask me about hope, I tell them about the American doctor who kept her promises even when keeping them was dangerous. Fatima's letter included photographs from the orphanage's current activities, expanded educational programs, a fully equipped medical clinic staffed by local personnel trained through international cooperation programs, and a new building that housed administrative offices for regional humanitarian coordination efforts. The orphanage had become something neither Amelia nor Hassan had originally envisioned, a symbol of what was possible when humanitarian work transcended political boundaries and cultural divisions. International visitors came regularly to study the cooperation models that had been developed there, while diplomatic initiatives throughout the region used it as a neutral venue for informal negotiations and confidence-building measures. 7 years later, the call came while Amelia was preparing for a lecture at Johns Hopkins School of Medicine, where she had accepted a position teaching courses on emergency medicine in conflict zones. The caller identified himself as Colonel Halil Khan, recently commissioned as a medical officer in the Afghan National Army after completing his medical degree at Georgetown University. Dr. Amelia, he said, his voice carrying both excitement and urgency, there has been a major earthquake in Kandahar province. The Afghan government has requested international medical assistance, and I have been asked to coordinate with American military medical teams. Will you consider leading the civilian medical response? The request represented everything that their work in Afghanistan had been building toward, a natural disaster response where Afghan and American medical personnel could work together as colleagues rather than as opposing forces navigating temporary cooperation agreements. Khan's role as coordinator reflected his unique position as someone trusted by both Afghan authorities and American military leadership. Amelia's response was immediate. I'll be on the next flight to Kabul. The earthquake response operation that followed became another model for international cooperation, but it also revealed how much had changed in the relationships between military and civilian medical personnel. Afghan doctors trained through cooperation programs worked alongside American military medics, while Taliban fighters provided security for medical facilities, treating earthquake victims regardless of their political affiliations. Khan's leadership during the crisis demonstrated the long-term benefits of investing in individual relationships that could survive political changes and military transitions. His credibility with all parties involved allowed for coordination that would have been impossible through formal diplomatic channels alone. But it was during a quiet moment between surgical cases that Khan shared the observation that best captured the transformation that had occurred over the years since his childhood treatment at the coalition base. Dr. Amelia, he said, removing his surgical gloves after completing an amputation that had saved a young earthquake victim's life. When I was a child, I thought courage was about fighting enemies. Now I understand that real courage is about healing them. The comment echoed thoughts that had occupied Amelia's mind throughout her years of working in conflict zones. Courage was indeed about making choices that prioritized human dignity over political advantage, that valued individual lives over strategic objectives, and that recognized the possibility of transformation even in the most polarized situations. 10 years later, Dr. Amelia Taylor received the call on a Tuesday morning while reviewing applications for the International Medical Neutrality Fellowship Program, an initiative she had helped establish to train medical personnel for work in conflict zones. The caller was Admiral Sarah Williams, now serving as the Navy's Surgeon General and one of the highest-ranking medical officers in the American military. "Amelia," Williams said, dispensing with formal titles that their friendship had long since made unnecessary, "I have an opportunity that I think will interest you. The Pentagon is establishing a new position, Director of International Medical Cooperation, and your name is at the top of every recommendation list. The position would represent the institutionalization of everything they had learned about medical neutrality and cross-cultural healthcare cooperation." Williams explained that the role would involve coordinating medical responses to international crises, establishing protocols for treating enemy combatants, and developing training programs for military medical personnel operating in complex cultural environments. "It's essentially what you've been doing for the past decade," Williams continued, "but with the resources and authority to implement these approaches on a global scale." Amelia's initial response was cautious. Government positions came with bureaucratic constraints that could limit the flexibility and responsiveness that made humanitarian medical work effective. But Williams anticipated her concerns and addressed them directly. "This wouldn't be a desk job in Washington," she explained. "The position requires extensive travel, field experience, and direct involvement in crisis response. Think of it as your current work, but with the backing of the Defense Department and State Department working together." The decision required careful consideration, but it was influenced by a letter that arrived later that same week from Ahmad Hassan. Now in his 70s, Hassan had continued directing the orphanage through a decade of remarkable growth and change. His letter carried news that brought both joy and a sense of completion to the work they had shared. "Dr. Amelia," Hassan wrote, "I am writing to inform you that the orphanage will soon graduate its first class of young people who have been accepted to universities around the world. Fatima will be studying international relations at Oxford, while 3 other graduates will attend medical school in the United States, Canada, and Germany." Hassan's letter continued with updates on other children whose lives had been shaped by the medical cooperation programs that had grown from their initial emergency treatment years earlier. 2 former orphans were now serving as interpreters for international humanitarian organizations, while another had been accepted to flight training as part of the Afghan Air Force medical evacuation program. "But most importantly," Hassan wrote, "these young people understand that their opportunities came from cooperation between people who chose to see possibility rather than just problems. They will carry this understanding with them wherever they go, and they will teach it to their own children." The letter included a photograph taken during the orphanage's 10th anniversary celebration. The image showed children and young adults from dozens of different ethnic and tribal backgrounds standing together in the courtyard where Amelia had once run through gunfire to treat wounded soldiers. Behind them, the buildings that had been scarred by conflict were now decorated with colorful murals depicting scenes of education, healing, and cooperation. But it was the final paragraph of Hassan's letter that convinced Amelia to accept the Pentagon position. "The work we began together has proven that healing is possible even in the most broken places. Now it is time to take these lessons to other broken places, to other children who need to see that adults can choose cooperation over conflict. The world needs what you have learned, Dr. Amelia. It needs it urgently. 12 years later, the secure video conference connected medical officers from conflict zones on 3 continents, with Dr. Amelia Taylor coordinating from her office in the Pentagon's newly constructed International Medical Cooperation Center. On her screen, she could see the faces of military doctors, civilian humanitarian workers, and local medical personnel who were applying protocols developed through years of field experience and careful refinement. The situation in South Sudan is following the pattern we've seen before, reported Dr. Maria Santos, a former student of Amelia's who is now leading medical neutrality efforts in East Africa. Initial skepticism from both sides, but growing cooperation as they see the practical benefits of coordinated medical care. Similar reports came from other regions where medical neutrality programs had been implemented. In Yemen, traditional enemies were cooperating to establish medical safe zones that allowed treatment of civilian casualties from all sides of the complex multi-party conflict. In Ukraine, military medical personnel from opposing forces had begun sharing information about treating certain types of battlefield injuries, leading to significantly improved survival rates for wounded combatants. But the most significant development was taking place in Syria, where Colonel Rodriguez, now Dr. Rodriguez, with dual military and medical authority, was implementing the most ambitious medical cooperation program yet attempted. "We're seeing something unprecedented here," Rodriguez reported during the weekly coordination call. "Local medical personnel who were trained through our programs are now training others, creating networks of cooperation that extend far beyond our original points of contact." Rodriguez's work in Syria had benefited from lessons learned through years of program refinement, but it also faced challenges that tested every aspect of their accumulated experience. The complexity of the Syrian conflict, with multiple state and non-state actors pursuing different objectives through various means, required diplomatic and medical skills that pushed the boundaries of what anyone had thought possible. "The key breakthrough," Rodriguez continued, "came when we realized that medical cooperation could provide communication channels between groups that couldn't engage directly. When you're treating someone's child, political differences become secondary to immediate human needs." The success of these programs had attracted attention from unexpected quarters. The Vatican had requested consultation on establishing medical neutrality protocols for areas where Catholic relief organizations operated alongside military forces. The International Red Cross was adapting their training programs based on military medical cooperation models. Even private sector medical organizations were incorporating conflict zone protocols into their international humanitarian work, but it was a message from an unexpected source that provided the most meaningful validation of everything they had accomplished. Commander Rashid Khan, now in his 70s and serving as an elder advisor to Taliban leadership, had sent word through diplomatic channels that he wanted to share information that could save American lives. "The old commander says he has intelligence about planned attacks on medical facilities," the diplomatic cable reported. "He wants to provide this information because he believes protecting medical neutrality serves Afghanistan's long-term interests better than short-term tactical advantages." Khan's cooperation represented the ultimate vindication of the approach they had taken years earlier when treating his son. The relationship built through medical care had survived political changes, military transitions, and the natural skepticism that accompanied prolonged conflict. The intelligence Khan provided led to the prevention of attacks on 3 medical facilities, saving an estimated 47 lives and preserving medical infrastructure that served both military and civilian populations. But more importantly, his willingness to protect medical neutrality had been observed by other Taliban leaders and had influenced their own decisions about targeting humanitarian facilities. 15 years later, Dr. Amelia Taylor stood once again in the courtyard of the Kabul orphanage, but the scene before her bore little resemblance to the conflict-scarred facility she remembered from her first deployment. The compound had expanded to include a fully accredited medical training institute, a regional coordination center for humanitarian operations, and administrative offices for the Afghan Ministry of Health's rural medical program. The occasion was the graduation ceremony for the first class of doctors, trained entirely through the International Medical Cooperation Program that had grown from their initial emergency treatment of Khalil Khan. 23 new physicians representing multiple ethnic groups, both genders and various political backgrounds, were taking their professional oaths in a ceremony that combined traditional Afghan customs with international medical ethics. Khalil Khan, now Dr. Khalil Khan, and serving as the program's director, conducted the ceremony in 3 languages, reflecting the multicultural nature of medical education that had evolved from their early experiments in cross-cultural cooperation. Today, he said, addressing the graduating class and distinguished guests that included medical officials from 17 countries, you become doctors not just in the technical sense, but in the moral sense. You commit to treating all patients according to their medical needs, regardless of their politics, their ethnicity, or their relationship to ongoing conflicts. The ceremony was attended by representatives from every major international medical organization, but it was the presence of ordinary Afghans, farmers, shopkeepers, tribal elders, and former fighters that made the event personally meaningful. For Amelia, these were people whose lives had been touched by medical cooperation programs, whose children had been treated at facilities that operated under neutrality protocols, whose communities had benefited from the expansion of medical services into areas that had been underserved for decades. But it was the final speaker who brought the ceremony full circle. Fatima Hassan, now Dr. Fatima Hassan, and serving as Afghanistan's Deputy Minister of Education, had traveled from Kabul to address the graduating class about the relationship between education and healing. "When I was a child in this orphanage," she said, her voice carrying across the courtyard to an audience that included many of the same children she had grown up with, "Dr. Amelia taught me that healing was about more than medicine. She showed me that healing was about building relationships that could survive anything, even war." Fatima's address continued with reflections on the changes that medical cooperation had brought to Afghanistan over the previous 15 years. Infant mortality rates had dropped by 60% in areas where neutrality protocols had been implemented. Educational opportunities for girls had expanded significantly in communities where medical programs had demonstrated the value of international cooperation. Economic development had accelerated in regions where medical infrastructure provided stability and attracted investment. But the most important change, Fatima concluded, is that children in this country now grow up seeing cooperation instead of only conflict. They see adults choosing to heal rather than harm. They see possibility instead of just problems. After the ceremony, Amelia walked through the medical training facility that occupied buildings where she had once treated emergency casualties under fire. The equipment was state-of-the-art, the training programs were internationally accredited, and the staff included some of the most skilled medical professionals she had encountered anywhere in the world. In the pediatric ward, she found Ahmad Hassan, now 81 years old, but still serving as the orphanage's honorary director, reading stories to children who represented the next generation of Afghans, growing up in a country where medical care transcended political divisions. "Dr. Amelia," he said, looking up from the children gathered around his chair, "do you remember what you told me on the day you first came here? You said you wanted to be useful." She nodded, remembering that conversation and the uncertainty that had motivated her original deployment to Afghanistan. "I have been thinking about usefulness for many years since then," Hassan continued. "I think usefulness is not about what you accomplish in one day or 1 year. Usefulness is about planting seeds that grow into trees that provide shade for people you will never meet." The observation was profound in its simplicity and accuracy. The medical cooperation programs that had grown from their initial emergency responses were now providing shade for thousands of people throughout the region, medical care for the sick, education for children, economic opportunities for families, and hope for communities that had experienced decades of conflict. As evening fell over Kabul, Amelia stood on the roof of the medical training facility, looking out over a city that remained challenging but no longer felt hopeless. The sounds of the city traffic, conversation, the call to prayer from nearby mosques created a symphony of normal life that had been impossible to imagine during her first deployment. She touched the silver compass at her throat, feeling its familiar weight and remembering her grandfather's words about courage and choice. Every direction was still a choice, but the choices available now included possibilities that hadn't existed 15 years earlier. Her satellite phone buzzed with an incoming message from the Pentagon. There was a new crisis developing in West Africa, where ethnic conflicts were creating humanitarian emergencies that required the kind of medical neutrality protocols they had developed and refined through years of experience. The message included a simple question: "Are you available for deployment?" Amelia's response was immediate and unambiguous: "Yes." As she prepared to leave Afghanistan once again, this time with the knowledge that her work there had created something sustainable and transformative, she reflected on the journey that had brought her from a comfortable conference room in Seattle to this moment of choosing new challenges in service of healing. The compass pointed north, as it always had. But north, she now understood completely, was wherever healing was needed most urgently. And there would always be places where healing was needed, where children waited for adults to choose cooperation over conflict, where the seeds of possibility could be planted by people willing to step into spaces where others feared to go. The silver compass caught the last light of the Afghan sun, reflecting not just the metal surface, but the accumulated wisdom of choices made in service of something larger than personal safety or comfort. Courage, her grandfather had taught her, was not the absence of fear, it was the choice to act rightly despite fear. Tomorrow she would be on a plane to West Africa, carrying with her the lessons learned through years of healing in one of the world's most challenging places. Behind her, she would leave a medical training institute, a functioning orphanage, and a generation of young Afghans who understood that cooperation was possible, even between people who had every reason to remain enemies. Most importantly, she would leave the knowledge that healing, real healing, was about more than treating individual patients. It was about mending the relationships that allowed communities to thrive, about building bridges that could span even the deepest divisions, and about demonstrating through practical action that there were always alternatives to violence for people with the courage to pursue them. The story that had begun with a young doctor's crisis of conscience in Seattle had become something larger than any individual story. It had become a model for how medical professionals could serve not just as healers of bodies, but as healers of the broader human condition. As Amelia descended the stairs from the roof, passing photographs that documented 15 years of medical cooperation and transformation, she carried with her the certain knowledge that courage was not a destination but a journey, and that journey would continue wherever healing was needed most urgently. In the distance, she could hear children laughing in the orphanage courtyard, the same sound that had motivated her grandfather in Vietnam, that had inspired her own choices in Afghanistan, and that would guide her work in whatever challenges lay ahead. Stories of courage and medical dedication, like Dr. Taylor's, take significant time and research to craft properly. If this story has inspired or moved you, please like this video, share it with someone who values stories of service and sacrifice, and subscribe to our channel for more true accounts of extraordinary people making a difference in the world's most challenging places.